The first hints of dawn stretched across San Francisco on the morning of April 18, 1906, painting the city in a soft, golden haze that glimmered off the fog-shrouded bay. Horse-drawn streetcars rattled along cobblestone streets, clanging their bells as they made their way to the bustling docks and marketplaces. The smell of fresh bread and roasted coffee beans drifted from corner bakeries, mingling with the briny scent of the harbor, where sailors shouted orders over the cries of seagulls and the lapping waves against the piers. In the Mission District, children chased each other through the alleys, laughing and shouting as they dodged laundry lines and horse manure. Women leaned from second-story windows, exchanging morning gossip while sweeping the sidewalks below. The streets were alive with a mixture of laborers heading to construction sites and white-collared workers adjusting their starched collars and polished boots for a day of business. It was a city at work, thriving, oblivious to the forces quietly gathering beneath its foundations. Among them was Clara Jensen, a young mother who had risen before the sun to prepare breakfast for her two children. Her hands moved swiftly, setting plates of eggs and toast on the table while keeping one eye on little Samuel, who darted between the kitchen and the living room in his morning energy. Clara glanced at the cracked wall near the doorway, small fissures she had noticed creeping along the plaster for weeks, but she shrugged them off. Old house settling, she murmured to herself, trying to ignore the unease that had begun to prick at her chest. Not far away, Thomas Gallagher, a veteran firefighter with more than 15 years of service, polished the brass fittings of his hose cart at Firehouse Number 5. He hummed a low tune, enjoying the morning calm. He had felt minor tremors in the days prior, vibrations too subtle to alarm anyone, but he trusted in the city's infrastructure. Buildings like City Hall and the Ferry Building had stood for decades, unshaken by smaller quakes. His colleagues teased him gently about being overly cautious, but he only smiled, silently thinking, better safe than sorry. Meanwhile, Luis Martinez, a dock worker with hands calloused from rope and rigging, was already hauling crates of lumber off a cargo ship. The harbor was alive with the sounds of men shouting, wood scraping against wood, and the occasional bark of a captain ordering his crew. Luis paused for a moment, noticing the water ripple strangely, a subtle, quick rise and fall that made him frown. He shook his head and returned to work, attributing it to the tides. Even the wealthy residents of Pacific Heights were oblivious. Margaret Whitmore, a society matron with a penchant for silk gowns and delicate lace gloves, sat sipping tea on her veranda, enjoying the quiet view of the bay. Her maid polished the silverware while whispering about the latest gossip from Nob Hill. Margaret, engrossed in her journal and the delicate aroma of jasmine tea, felt no sense of danger, not even as the old wooden railing beneath her elbow creaked faintly. Across the city, small tremors whispered through the streets, subtle, almost imperceptible. Windows rattled, a few books tumbled from shelves, and the earth hummed a low, throbbing warning. Some noticed, some ignored it. A grocer muttered about another restless night, while a streetcar conductor tapped his foot impatiently on the floor. The city moved as it always had, confident in its resilience, unaware that the ground beneath it was already plotting destruction. In Chinatown, merchants arranged fruits in delicate silk garments along the narrow streets, shouting greetings to early customers. Lanterns swayed gently in the morning breeze, casting flickering shadows on the walls. Mei Ling, a young shopkeeper, paused to glance at a tiny crack forming near the base of her store's wall. She touched it with her finger, frowning. The tremors had been persistent, but the city was resilient, she told herself. It was just the building settling, surely nothing more. The docks, the hills, the grand avenues all were alive with movement and ordinary worries. A butcher argued with his apprentice over the thickness of a cut, a barber combed the hair of a wealthy client while gossiping about the mayor's latest decision, and a baker cursed as a batch of bread fell from a cart into the muddy street. Life went on, layered with the sounds, smells, and chaos that made San Francisco a city teeming with character and vitality. Amid these ordinary scenes, the subtle signs of the city's fragility gathered quietly. A lamppost leaned slightly to the north. Cobblestones had shifted along Market Street. In a schoolyard, children noticed the swing set wobble. These were small, almost trivial things, but together they whispered of the brewing disaster beneath. In the darkness of the morning, while most of the city went about its routines, some individuals felt unease more acutely. Thomas Gallagher glanced skyward at the smoke from a distant smokestack, sensing something heavy in the air. Clara Jensen paused by the cracked wall, unease tightening around her chest. Luis Martinez felt the dockboards vibrate strangely under his boots. It was the calm before the storm, a silence that carried the weight of anticipation, though none could name it yet. And then there were those who had no inkling at all, the ones asleep in their beds, dreaming of mundane mornings, blissfully unaware that their world was about to shatter. Across the city, in homes, hotels, and boarding houses, people slept, ate, and prepared for the day ahead, each one a thread in the intricate tapestry of life that made San Francisco vibrant, bustling, and, at that moment, unsuspecting. By the time the first rays of sunlight pierced the fog over the bay, the city was fully awake, bustling and alive, yet poised precariously on the edge of catastrophe. No one knew that in just a few short hours, the foundations of their world would tremble violently, that streets would split, buildings would collapse, and fire would consume entire neighborhoods. The ordinary morning, so full of life and promise, was the last breath of peace before a disaster that would change San Francisco forever. The clock ticked toward 5:12 a.m. when a rumble from deep beneath the earth began, subtle at first, like a distant drumbeat. And then, without warning, the ground beneath the city would roar to life. At precisely 5:12 a.m., the earth beneath San Francisco roared to life. A deep, guttural tremor shuddered through the streets, rattling windows and shaking buildings to their very foundations. The city's awakening clashed violently with the force of nature. Streetcars lurched violently on derailed tracks, horse-drawn carriages toppled onto the cobblestones, and the clatter of falling debris echoed across the hills. The morning calm was ripped apart in an instant. Clara Jensen had just finished pouring tea when the first quake struck. Her body jolted violently as the plates and cups on the table rattled, crashing to the floor with a sharp clatter. Samuel screamed as the high chair tipped slightly, and Clara grabbed him, instinctively shielding him with her own body. The wall near the kitchen groaned, plaster cracking and dust cascading into the air. She could hear the faint sound of her neighbors' screams drifting through the thin walls, carried by the groaning timbers. Every heartbeat felt stretched, a taut wire vibrating with fear. Across the city, Thomas Gallagher reacted instinctively. Years of firefighting had trained him for emergencies, but nothing could prepare him for the raw, indiscriminate power of the earth itself. He bolted from the firehouse, tripping over the uneven boards as the ground undulated beneath his feet. A streetcar tipped sideways nearby, sending sparks flying and splintering wood onto the pavement. Gallagher helped a young man tangled in the streetcar harness to his feet, shouting over the roar of collapsing buildings, his voice hoarse but commanding. Luis Martinez gripped a crate of lumber on the docks when the quake struck. The boards slid and toppled, pinning his foot and sending pain shooting up his leg. He fell to the wet planks, narrowly avoiding a falling crane that groaned and twisted, threatening to crush the entire pier. Around him, the harbor erupted in chaos. Sailors screamed as masts snapped, cargo crates rolled into the water, and the ships moaned against their ropes. The calm lapping of the bay had been replaced with a violent surge, as the water itself seemed to quake in fear. Even in the affluent Pacific Heights, Margaret Whitmore's morning serenity shattered. The veranda railing groaned, threatening to give way under her weight, and fine porcelain teacups tipped and shattered on the marble floor. She clutched at the rail as the floorboards beneath her creaked ominously. Her maid screamed from behind her, grabbing Margaret by the arm as the room trembled violently. The chandelier swayed dangerously overhead, casting flickering shadows that danced across the walls like sinister specters. The tremors moved with an unpredictable rhythm. Some streets buckled and split, creating jagged fissures that swallowed sidewalks and uprooted lampposts. Buildings swayed like trees in a storm, their foundations quaking with the relentless pulse of the earth. Victorian homes, once admired for their delicate architecture, twisted and crumbled, sending clouds of dust into the morning air. Windows exploded, showering streets below with shards of glass, and chimneys toppled, crashing onto unsuspecting bystanders. Clara and Samuel stumbled into the street, joining a throng of terrified neighbors fleeing their homes. People ran barefoot over broken cobblestones, some tripping into fissures that cracked open beneath their feet. Smoke and dust began to mingle, reducing visibility and filling lungs with choking grit. A fire ignited nearby as a gas line ruptured, sending tongues of flame licking up the side of a building. Clara held her child close, navigating through the chaos, her eyes wide with horror and determination. At Firehouse Number 5, Gallagher's team fought to mobilize, but the quake had destroyed key equipment. Hoses were torn from their connections, wheels jammed on collapsed tracks, and water mains ruptured. They ran from street to street, helping the injured and directing fleeing citizens, their bravery only heightened by the sheer enormity of the destruction around them. Every moment demanded split-second decisions: save the trapped, dodge falling debris, and avoid the encroaching fires threatening to consume whole blocks. Luis Martinez dragged himself away from the pier, blood running from scrapes on his arms, as the dock beneath him quaked violently. The waters surged into the harbor irregularly, throwing small boats against one another and sending cargo into the sea. Sailors scrambled for safety, some leaping into the water to avoid falling cranes and planks. The bay, usually a symbol of commerce and life, had become another element of danger in the city's turmoil. In Chinatown, Mei Ling clutched her younger brother as the quake tore through the narrow streets. Lanterns swung violently, colliding with walls and setting fire to draperies. Merchants screamed as their wares spilled into the street, glass bottles and silk fabric mixing in a chaotic, colorful mess. The scent of incense and spices, once comforting, was now overpowered by dust, smoke, and the acrid stench of burning wood. Every corner of the city seemed to collapse simultaneously. Bridges swayed alarmingly over the bay, threatening to snap entirely. Hillsides slid into streets below, crushing carts and burying wagons. The roar of the earth itself, a deep, unrelenting rumble, was punctuated by screams, the crack of splintering timber, and the shrill cries of horses caught in the panic. San Francisco's thriving streets had transformed into a labyrinth of danger, fear, and survival instinct. Amid the terror, moments of human courage shone. Gallagher pulled a man from under a fallen beam, ignoring his own scraped hands. Clara protected Samuel as they guided neighbors to an open square, using their bodies as shields against falling debris. Luis Martinez, limping but determined, helped pull a sailor from a collapsing dock ladder, ignoring the pain in his leg. Across the city, strangers became allies, instinctively united by a single goal: to survive. By the time the shaking began to subside, though not fully, the city was unrecognizable. Streets were fractured, buildings partially collapsed, and the air thick with dust and smoke. Fires were beginning to flare along the waterfront and in alleyways fueled by broken gas lines. San Francisco's inhabitants were shaken, bruised, and terrified, but alive. The first minutes of the disaster claimed lives and property indiscriminately, and yet the worst was still to come. From the hills of Twin Peaks to the piers of the Embarcadero, the city lay in a tense, trembling aftermath. The tremors had lasted barely a minute, but in that short span, it had shattered the sense of security that San Franciscans had taken for granted. The morning that had begun in calm, bustling routine had ended in chaos, leaving the population reeling, streets impassable, and fires threatening to turn the city into an inferno. And in that fragile stillness, as people began to gather in open spaces, clutching loved ones and staring in disbelief at the ruined buildings, a new terror emerged: the fire. What had begun as gas leaks and scattered embers now spread with terrifying speed, fueled by wooden structures and the morning wind. San Francisco, alive and vibrant only hours before, now teetered on the brink of total devastation. Panic gripped every street, every alley, every neighborhood. The tremors had stopped, but the danger had not. And as the smoke began to rise, a city of thousands faced a new enemy, one that would test courage, humanity, and survival in ways no one could have imagined. The quake had passed, but the city was far from safe. San Francisco lay in a state of stunned silence, punctuated by the distant roar of collapsing buildings and the crackling of small fires ignited by ruptured gas lines. The air was thick with dust, smoke, and the acrid tang of burning wood. Streets, once bustling with commerce, were now impassable rivers of debris, broken cobblestones, and overturned carts. But the destruction was only the beginning. From the corner of Clay and Montgomery Streets, Clara Jensen surveyed the ruins around her, clutching Samuel tightly to her chest. Her home was reduced to a jagged shell. The kitchen wall collapsed into a heap of rubble. The faint morning light was obscured by smoke rising from the nearby buildings. Flames licked the sky, consuming wooden tenements with a frightening appetite. The crackle of fire and the roar of the wind through shattered streets made it impossible to hear voices over a few feet away. Nearby, Thomas Gallagher coordinated with fellow firefighters, their faces streaked with soot and sweat. Hoses were torn, hydrants crushed under rubble, and water pressure low, but they refused to relent. They fought with desperate ingenuity, forming human chains to transport buckets of water from the few unbroken sources. The fire moved faster than they could contain it, devouring entire blocks as if the city itself were being consumed by an angry god. Gallagher barked orders, saving trapped families when possible, directing citizens away from engulfed buildings, and risking his life in ways that would define him forever in the aftermath. Luis Martinez, having made it away from the docks, now ran through the streets in shock. The pier he had worked on just minutes before was now a smoldering wreck, half submerged in the bay. He paused to help a sailor pinned beneath a fallen beam. The man's leg was crushed, his face pale with pain and fear. Together, they lifted the timber just enough to crawl to safety. Around them, water from broken mains and overturned barrels created a treacherous, slippery surface, but every second mattered. Each delay meant more lives threatened by fire or collapse. In Chinatown, May Lane clutched her younger brother, pulling him along the narrow, smoke-choked alleys. Lanterns had shattered in the quake, their oil igniting the flammable wood around them. Merchants wailed as silk, spices, and pottery were destroyed, but there was no time to grieve. May Lane guided families toward the open space of Portsmouth Square, shouting over the roar of the flames and the wind. Strangers became allies, linking arms to form human chains that carried the injured, protected children, and tried to hold back the encroaching inferno. The firestorm spread like wildfire across the wooden neighborhoods, leaping gaps in the streets and igniting whole city blocks. The wind, once a gentle caress off the bay, now fanned the flames mercilessly. Buildings already weakened by the quake were reduced to kindling. Smoke rolled through the streets in thick black clouds, making eyes water and lungs burn. The city smelled of ash, scorched wood, and human fear. People coughed and gagged, shielding themselves with coats or scraps of fabric as they fled. Amid the chaos, moments of extraordinary bravery emerged. Gallagher and his team found a family trapped in a partially collapsed tenement. A young girl clutched a doll, trembling with terror, while her mother tried to shield her from the smoke. Gallagher lifted the debris with help from volunteers, ignoring his own injuries as splinters cut his arms. Once free, he guided them to a safe street corner, where neighbors offered blankets and water, a brief respite from the hell surrounding them. Clara and Samuel moved with the crowd through open squares and parks, where firefighters and volunteers were gathering the wounded. She passed a man attempting to save a small dog, carrying it in his arms as if it were a child.
Around them, people shouted instructions, carried children over rubble, and helped the elderly navigate jagged streets. Humanity endured amid catastrophe, small lights in a city otherwise consumed by fire and smoke. Luis Martinez stumbled into an open plaza, where a makeshift triage area had been established. Injured men and women lay on blankets or in the dust, moaning softly or silently clutching limbs. Volunteers moved among them, applying bandages, distributing water, and offering comforting words. Luis helped carry an elderly man whose leg had been broken by falling debris. He realized then that survival was as much about helping others as it was about protecting oneself. But terror and despair also thrived. Looters prowled the ruined streets, taking advantage of families distracted by flames or injury. Fires leaped closer as they rummaged through abandoned stores, adding fuel to the inferno. The moral fabric of the city was stretched taut, and people were forced to make rapid life-and-death choices. Those who chose courage and cooperation stood out like beacons amid the chaos. Above the city, smoke rose in immense dark columns, visible for miles. From the hills and ferries, distant observers saw the city ablaze, its famous skyline obscured by fire and ruin. Telegraph lines were damaged, slowing communication, and the rest of the nation began to hear fragmented reports of the catastrophe. Shock rippled across the country as newspapers, teletype, and word of mouth spread tales of a city in flames, thousands of lives imperiled, and neighborhoods completely destroyed. The human drama continued relentlessly. Children cried for parents, parents searched frantically for children. Strangers formed ad hoc rescue teams, dragging people from the debris or shielding them from falling sparks. Every street was a battleground. One moment, safe passage through a dust-filled square, the next, a building collapsed or flames jumped the gap between structures. Survival demanded agility, bravery, and quick thinking. Even as the inferno raged, some residents fought stubbornly to salvage remnants of their lives. Shopkeepers risked returning briefly to their burned-out stores to grab documents or cash. Families attempted to rescue keepsakes, photographs, and heirlooms. The city had lost almost everything, but its people refused to surrender their memories, clinging to fragments of their former lives amid the ruin. By mid-morning, entire neighborhoods were unrecognizable. Streets that had once echoed with the sounds of commerce now lay buried in ash, splintered wood, and shattered glass. Fires raged uncontrollably, sending embers flying across blocks. From North Bay to the Mission, citizens fought for survival, using whatever means they could: water from overturned barrels, makeshift sandbags, and sheer human determination. Amid the horror, tiny sparks of hope persisted. Volunteers and firefighters worked tirelessly, often risking their lives to save others. Strangers became family, helping each other navigate the chaos. Clara found a group of women huddled in a park with children, and together they formed a chain to help the elderly escape collapsing buildings. Luis assisted a rescue effort at a partially collapsed warehouse, lifting beams with strangers and moving the wounded to safety. Gallagher, bloodied and exhausted, continued to direct efforts, his courage emblematic of the city's tenacity. As the sun rose higher, the scale of devastation became clear. The earthquake had shattered the city, but the fires were threatening to erase it entirely. Smoke and flame had turned streets into rivers of heat, and the cries of the frightened mingled with the roar of burning timber. San Francisco, once a city of life and energy, now faced an inferno that demanded every ounce of human courage and endurance. In those hours, the city's true character emerged, not in buildings or commerce, but in the resilience, bravery, and unity of its inhabitants. Every rescue, every hand extended to lift another, was a testament to the human spirit. And yet, despite these acts of heroism, the flames continued to advance, threatening to consume everything in their path. The morning of terror was far from over, and the citizens of San Francisco faced a stark truth. Survival demanded ingenuity, bravery, and above all, hope.
By the time the sun climbed higher in the sky, San Francisco was unrecognizable. Streets that had once echoed with laughter, commerce, and the clatter of streetcars were now choked with rubble, ash, and the acrid stench of fire. Entire neighborhoods had vanished beneath smoke and collapsed timber, while others were reduced to charred skeletons of buildings. The city had endured the violent shaking of the earth and the merciless advance of flame, and yet, amid the devastation, people moved with determination, survival instincts sharpened to a razor's edge. Clara Jensen stood in the open expanse of Portsmouth Square, her arms wrapped protectively around Samuel. They were among the thousands who had escaped the flames, but the streets around them were littered with debris and the remnants of homes. Smoke still curled from burning blocks, and the occasional collapse of a weakened structure sent clouds of ash into the air. Clara's eyes scanned the crowd. Neighbors she had known for years, now strangers, united only by survival. Mothers held children, men helped the injured, and volunteers tried to organize the chaos into something resembling order.
Nearby, Thomas Gallagher and his firefighting team had regrouped. Though exhausted, covered in soot and blood from minor cuts and burns, they continued their work with a grim resolve. Hydrants had been repaired where possible, water redirected from intact sources, and the remaining fires battled with whatever hoses and buckets could be salvaged. Gallagher moved among the survivors, directing efforts, offering encouragement, and lending hands where needed. Every small victory, rescuing a trapped family, extinguishing a stubborn fire, felt monumental against the scale of destruction. Luis Martinez navigated the ruined streets with the aid of other dock workers and volunteers. The pier he had worked on, once a hub of activity, was now partially submerged in the bay, with charred remnants of warehouses jutting from the water. He helped an elderly couple climb over debris to reach a safe street, his legs still bruised and aching from the quake. Around him, survivors scavenged what they could: blankets, food, anything to sustain them. Despite exhaustion, the human instinct to help persisted, proving that even in catastrophe, solidarity could emerge. Chinatown, though scarred by fire and structural collapse, had become a hub of improvised aid. Mei Ling worked alongside neighbors, distributing water, guiding children and the elderly, and offering words of comfort to the terrified. The once lively streets, though smoldering, were now alive with cooperation. Merchants shared whatever food they could salvage, families formed protective circles, and volunteers dug through rubble to rescue anyone trapped. The flames had taken homes and livelihoods, but they could not erase the determination of the people within. Across the city, the scale of destruction became more apparent as observers from elevated points took stock. From Twin Peaks, the panorama was terrifying. Smoke spiraled into the sky from countless fires, streets twisted with collapsed buildings, and the once thriving neighborhoods looked like battlefields. The fire had been relentless, consuming wooden structures with furious speed, leaving stone and brick landmarks standing as lonely testaments to what had been. Bridges over the bay swayed in partial collapse, while the waterfront was littered with debris from toppled piers. Despite the chaos, news of the disaster reached beyond the city. Telegraph lines, though damaged, began to transmit fragmented reports of the devastation. Across the United States, people read newspaper headlines describing San Francisco in flames, thousands of citizens injured or displaced, and entire blocks reduced to ash. Relief committees sprang into action from New York, Chicago, and other major cities. Aid was sent in the form of tents, blankets, food, and medical supplies. Messages of solidarity poured in from ordinary citizens and prominent figures alike. The nation, though hundreds of miles away, felt the shock, grief, and urgency of the city's plight. Survivors began to adapt to the new reality. Makeshift shelters arose in parks, open squares, and cleared lots. Families huddled together, keeping children close and forming protective clusters. Volunteers organized food distribution, tended to the wounded, and maintained order in the face of overwhelming chaos. Each act, whether small or monumental, became a lifeline amid the ruins. Clara, though exhausted, helped guide others to safe areas, finding purpose in aiding fellow survivors as much as in protecting her own family. The stories of heroism were numerous. Gallagher's team continued their tireless work, often risking falling timbers and spreading embers to rescue trapped citizens. Luis Martinez, alongside other dock workers, waded into partially submerged warehouses to rescue those who could not escape on their own. Mei Ling and other community leaders organized chains to carry water to small fires and protect the most vulnerable. Each act of courage and compassion highlighted the resilience of the human spirit in the face of overwhelming disaster. Amid the immediate relief efforts, attention also turned to rebuilding. City planners, engineers, and government officials surveyed the destruction with an eye towards reconstruction. They documented which areas were most devastated, noted the failures of older structures, and began planning for more resilient building techniques. Lessons were learned in real time. Streets needed better access for emergency services, water mains had to be reinforced, and fireproof construction materials would be essential in preventing future catastrophes from escalating. Families mourned the lives lost, homes destroyed, and livelihoods obliterated. Yet even in sorrow, hope began to take root. Children played cautiously in cleared areas, scavengers salvaged personal items from debris, and neighbors shared food and water. San Francisco citizens, battered but unbroken, faced the future with a determination that matched the fury of the natural forces that had tested them. Weeks later, the city had begun to rise from the ashes. Temporary housing sprawled across open lots, relief tents offered shelter to thousands, and volunteers worked tirelessly to clean streets, provide medical care, and maintain order in the face of overwhelming chaos. Each act, whether small or monumental, became a lifeline amid the ruins. Clara, though exhausted, helped guide others to safe areas, finding purpose in aiding fellow survivors as much as in protecting her own family. Thomas Gallagher, though battered and weary, smiled family as he witnessed families reunited and citizens beginning to reclaim their city. Luis Martinez helped another elderly man navigate debris-strewn streets, feeling the first sense of hope since the quake. Mei Ling guided children to safety, exhausted but relieved to see her community surviving. San Francisco, though scarred and battered, had endured. From the tremors of the earthquake to the fury of the flames, from the cries of panic to the acts of courage and kindness, the city had proven that even in catastrophe, humanity could rise from ashes. And in the hearts of those who had lived through the disaster, a deep, unshakable resilience had taken root, a force as enduring as the city itself.